I recently added a pair of chairs in our bedroom, and I noticed that I need something, somewhere flat to set a cup, my phone, whatever. So I decided to make a little concrete end table, and it took me a few tries. Guys, I screwed up big on this one, but I finally pulled it off, and I love the end result. Keep watching to learn what not to do, and ultimately the steps that I took to get this cool, modern, fluted concrete end table.
This video is sponsored by DAP Products. The first thing I did was to head to Home Depot to purchase a 12-inch diameter concrete form tube. These forms are lightweight, fairly inexpensive, and a great way to get a smooth cylinder shape. I thought the easiest design to start with would be a simple cylinder, so that's where I started, but decided to add a toe kick just to make it a little bit more finished looking.
Normally, I would probably cut this concrete form tube with a reciprocating saw, but with the design of my table, it's really important that the bottom and top edges are perfectly parallel. I want to make sure that my table sits vertically. So to get as parallel of a cut as I can to our sidewall, I'm going to be using my table saw, and I've got my fence set up.
I added a sacrificial fence to the front of my miter gauge to give me a little bit more height, and then placed the form tube on top of the table of my saw with the blade down. Once the tube was in place with the end against the fence and the back of the radius making contact flat against the miter gauge, I slowly started to raise the blade just until it made it through the cardboard. I was worried that the unsecured end of the tube would go flying off once I had completed the cut, so I stopped rotating the tube just barely before I made a full radius.
Seemed to work very well. I've got a really nice clean line. I just stopped short with this tiny little bit attached, so I'm just going to use a utility knife, cut the paper, and I'm good.
Creating just a straight cylinder is pretty simple, but to create the recessed area for the toe kick, I had to get a little creative.
I need to create a band, something flexible that I can wrap around the bottom of the form to create that toe kick area. What I am going to use is this. It is a cork underlayment. It's made from recycled cork. It's really cool looking. I tried to put it on a wall. Didn't work. So anyways, I have a lot of it. So I think I'm going to use my table saw again to cut this down into strips. That way I can kind of layer them, laminate them together to get the thickness that I need.
I cut multiple 3-inch wide strips of the cork using my table saw.
Okay, got my foam cut. I think I'm going to go with 4 layers thick. They're about 1/4 inch, so we're around 1 inch for the little toe kick area. I have an extra piece of the concrete form tube, and I'm going to use it to glue the strips in, basically creating a little mold. Once it's fully dried, we'll waterproof it and put it in our final form. I've already cut the strips to length. Obviously, the inner strips are a little bit shorter than the outer strips, and then I numbered them so I know which one goes where. I think I'm going to stick them together using wood glue. I want something that's going to slip around a little bit so I can dial in my adjustment.
The Weldwood wood glue worked perfectly for laminating the strips together. The viscosity was easy to spread and allowed the glue to work itself into all the nooks and crannies of the cork. I also had plenty of working time to get all the strips placed inside the form tube without the glue starting to cure. Make sure you check out the description box for a full list of all the products and tools that I used on this project. Once all the cork strips were in place, I left them in the tube and allowed the glue to dry overnight. Liking what you see? Tag that like button down below. And if you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe as well.
Got my ring made. Looks kind of like a giant cork donut. Now I need to waterproof it. I also want to smooth out some of the rough texture from the cork. So we are going to gift wrap it in some packing tape. I'm going to wrap the whole thing around, try to smooth it over, and hopefully that works.
I took my time and made sure that every square inch of cork was covered with the plastic packing tape. I knew a solid concrete cylinder would be insanely heavy. So next, I turned my attention to a kind of unique material, foam pool noodles. The idea was to create a lightweight foam core that would take the place of some of the concrete in the center of the cylinder. This is a way to not only save some material, but also drastically lighten the weight of the finished table.
All right, all my pool noodles are cut down to length, and I did a little test arrangement inside this scrap piece of tube and found out that I want to do 7 of them kind of clustered in like a flower shape in the middle, and I'm going to stick them together using some construction adhesive.
I laid down strips of masking tape on my workbench and then began to attach the pool noodle pieces to each other using construction adhesive. With all the noodles clustered together, I then used the tape to tightly bind them while the construction adhesive set up.
These are the pool noodles that you saw me cutting before. I put them together in what I'm calling pool noodle dynamite. And then to seal the top, I just covered it with some duct tape. That's going to prevent aggregate and water and the rest of the concrete mix from getting down inside of the pool noodles. My concrete form is done. You can see my foam ring on the bottom side. So it is time to grab a piece of melamine and to attach my form.
To attach the form to the melamine, I used DAP Dynaflex Ultra Exterior Sealant. I moved it to an area of my workshop where I would be working and made sure to use some shims and a level to ensure that my form was sitting as flat as possible.
Concrete time. I am just going to be mixing in my regular steel wheelbarrow, and I am using regular high strength Quikrete. Ideally, I'd probably want to use like a countertop mix or something with a little bit smaller aggregate, but I had this on hand. So I'm going to mix it up with a shovel, get it in to my forms, and try to get it evenly applied without damaging them.
I recommend wearing a mask whenever you're mixing powdered concrete, even though you don't see me wearing one in this clip. For this first smooth-sided iteration of the end table, I used 2 60-pound bags of concrete. That sounds really heavy because it is. I probably could have gotten away with using more pool noodles in the core. Once the tube was full to the top, I began to agitate the form. This helps to work out air bubbles from the concrete, which will ultimately give you a smoother surface finish. You can agitate the form by hand, but a much better way is to use a little bit of battery-powered assistance. A random orbital sander will work, or you can use my preferred method, a reciprocating saw with no blade.
It's the next day, and I think I'm ready to demold my table. It's been about 24 hours. We're probably ready to remove the form. So let's give it a shot.
I actually had a bit of trouble breaking the seal of the Dynaflex Ultra and ended up having to bust out my oscillating multi-tool. Luckily, the multi-tool was also really helpful for splitting the side of the concrete form tube. I worked slowly and was careful to only cut the cardboard, preserving the concrete underneath. Once the cardboard was scored, it was easy to pry back the form tube and to take a look at my table. I wish I could have reused the cork toe kick form, but unfortunately, I couldn't figure out a way to remove it in one piece. There were a few sharp edges on the concrete left over from the form, so while the concrete was still green or fresh, I carefully used a putty knife to scrape them flat. You can see, even though I agitated my concrete, I still ended up with quite a few voids or little air pockets on the surface. It's not ideal.
All right, I need to get the end tables flipped on their end. I'm gonna try to pull the foam out from inside. If it can't come out, it's not the end of the world. It's pretty light, it can stay up in there. But these things weigh 120 pounds now, plus. So I recruited some help, and we laid some extra cork on the floor to give it some cushion.
These things weigh 120 pounds now.
And we're gonna try laying them down and flipping them over.
We were able to pull out the foam pool noodles, so we decided might as well. But honestly, we could have left them inside the table permanently and it wouldn't have caused any problems.
Most of the concrete turned out pretty good. I do have a few little pits here and there. There's also a few spots where that swirly line from the form is obvious. So I'm going to mix up a little bit of extra concrete, try to just sift off the powder, not use any of the aggregate, and use that as like a filler to go in and fill in all these little imperfections.
Luckily, the concrete sealer is pretty easy to apply and actually dries pretty quickly, so it's easy to apply multiple coats in a short period of time. I also cut out a round of the scrap cork underlayment to attach to the bottom of the table to prevent it from scratching our floors. With all the pitting and the obvious form marks, I wasn't really happy with this end table result, so I decided to try out a different design. Something a little bit more ornate.
To create the recessed vertical flutes on the sides of the table, I picked up what's called screen molding or screen trim. It's about 1/2 inch wide, only about 3/16 thick. This particular kind is made out of PVC, which is very important because it's waterproof. That means it won't absorb water from the concrete, causing the trim to swell and potentially causing a lot of problems with adhesion, things like that. As you can see, it's super flimsy, so to make it a little bit safer to cut, I'm going to tape all of these sticks together using some masking tape. That's called gang cutting, and it's a much safer way to cut little flimsy pieces of material on your miter saw. It is now time to start adding trim to the inside of my concrete form so I can get those little recessed flutes. I kind of played around with the layout, did some experiments to figure out how I was going to get each of the flutes evenly spaced. I basically created my own square by gluing together 2 pieces of aluminum using some rapid fuse. And that gave me my 4 compass points. I calculated the exact spacing on SketchUp, which is a computer program. And then, real life experimentation, I came up with a distance of about 1 inch in between each of the pieces of trim. So to create that space, I just cut a little strip of wood veneer. I'm going to start by attaching the trim to those 4 compass points. And then going around using my little spacer, I will fill in between those points.
In total, I attached 24 pieces of the PVC trim. As I worked and before the construction adhesive fully set up, I used squares and my Craig multi-mark to make sure that each piece was being applied vertically. I attached the form to a different melamine base, just like I did with the first form, and also included another bundle of foam pool noodles for the core. Even though I used a couple more pool noodles, the second table also took 2 60-pound bags of concrete. I allowed the concrete to cure for about 24 hours and then began to remove my form. Right away, I could tell I was in trouble.
So I made a big dumb mistake, and my rush to work through the project and not allow my construction adhesive to dry fully is biting me in the butt. So I went to go remove the concrete form tube, and all of my trim pieces for the little flute stuck to the concrete. The adhesive was totally wet and just didn't stick to the form at all. I have been trying to pull these little pieces of trim out, and they are really embedded in there. No matter what I've done, I've already gotten a lot of chip out along the edges, so I think I'm just going to have to get a little bit more aggressive, probably get a hammer, maybe a chisel, to get these out, and then we're just gonna embrace the rustic look.
Initially, I tried to be gentle and to pry the pieces of trim away from the concrete, but pretty soon realized that wasn't going to happen. Eventually, I got to the point where I just embraced the mistake. At least the chips and the uneven texture were somewhat uniform, but the super distressed column look was not what I was going for. I decided to try a third and final design option, which included a modern scalloped look and a toe kick from the first design.
To create the half round shapes on the inside of the form, I picked up some quarter round molding. It's your basic quarter round that you can find, at Home Depot. This is also made out of PVC. I'm going to connect pairs of them together to create, these little triangular shapes, and then I'll connect those together in a series, and then that will ultimately give me a half round shape, hopefully. The only problem is there's about a 3/16 side wall outside of the rounds. And if I were to just connect the trim next to each other, I'd be left with almost half an inch gap between, each half round shape. To make that space smaller, I'm going to run the trim through my table saw, and I'm going to cut off the majority of one of these sidewalls. That way, when I glue the pieces together, I will just get, a narrower point between the rounds.
I ran the trim through my table saw with one of the flat sides up against the blade, trimming off about 1/8 of an inch. I then cut each piece down to length using a miter saw. Since I had about 30 pieces to cut and I wanted them all the same length, I set up a really simple jig by clamping a square to my miter saw fence.
My quarter round trim pieces are ripped down. They've got a really fine edge, and now I am using some Rapid Fuse all-purpose. It's a fast-setting CA glue to attach them together.
I can almost guarantee if you've watched more than one of my videos, you have seen me use DAP Rapid Fuse. It's a clear, quick-setting CA glue that dries in about 30 seconds. I used it on all sorts of projects, but it was especially useful working with these kind of small, fiddly shaped pieces. When I have used PVC trim on concrete forms before, I was always really diligent about caulking all of my seams, and I didn't do that on my first form. So now I'm getting ready to work with this guy, which is much more complicated. So you better believe I got some silicone sealant, and I am going to be caulking every single seam. I carefully sealed each seam using DAP Silicone Max 100% silicone sealant.
This form has a lot of detail, and I really want to make sure I don't get any honeycombing or some of that void between the concrete. So I'm going to pour smaller lifts of concrete and really make sure that I am tamping it in between, trying to work the concrete into all these contours.
In addition to agitating the concrete using a reciprocating saw, like on the other two tables, I also used a small stick and really tamped the concrete in lifts, or levels, as I was pouring it. I took my time and made sure I worked out as much air as possible. I allowed my concrete to cure, this time for about 48 hours, and then began to remove the form. I could tell immediately this table was the winner. I brushed on 4 coats of concrete sealant, and my new end table was done.
It took a little while, but I am very, very happy with the final result. I really like the half round fluting, and I love the little step. The only thing I would wish is that maybe the table was slightly larger. So if I were to do this again, I would look for a concrete form tube that was a little bit larger. I would also probably add maybe another inch in height.
If you want to see more of the DIY modern house that we built, I recommend you check out the full Building Modern on a Budget series. If you like other types of DIY content, check out this video as well. And as always, thanks for watching, guys.